My name is Iris. I'm 65, and I never imagined the people I loved most would become the source of my deepest heartbreak. One quiet night, I heard my daughter whisper to her husband, "We'll get it all done by Christmas." She can't. She didn't finish her sentence. She didn't need to. I knew it was about me. And that moment changed everything. Tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories about family drama, emotional courage, and real-life resilience. I've replayed that night in my mind so many times that the details feel etched into my memory like scratches on glass, sharp, permanent, and impossible to buff out. It started the same way any quiet evening tends to start for a woman my age. I had finished folding a small load of laundry, placed the towels in the hallway closet, and was settling in with a simple paperback I'd borrowed from the library earlier that week. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, just a calm night in my daughter's home, where I'd been staying for a few months to rest after a difficult winter. I wasn't sick. I wasn't falling apart. I was just older. And after losing my husband 2 years earlier, nights sometimes felt too long, and days felt too quiet. My daughter, Emily, insisted I stay with her for a while, and truthfully, I had been grateful for the company at first. I trusted her. I trusted her husband, too, though we were never particularly close. But family is family, and as a woman who grew up in a small Ohio town, I've always believed that trust is the first thing you give and the last thing you take back. That night, however, trust was the very thing slipping through my fingers. It was almost 11 when I remembered that I hadn't had much water all day. A silly thing, but staying hydrated seems to become more important the older you get. My throat felt dry and somewhat scratchy, and I figured I'd walk to the kitchen for a glass of water before settling back into bed. I slipped on my soft house slippers and opened the door gently so it wouldn't creak. The hall light was off, which wasn't unusual at that hour. But the living room lamp, one of those warm, yellowish lamps that sits on a side table, was still glowing faintly. That wasn't unusual either. Emily often forgot to turn it off. I was about to step toward the kitchen when I heard something that stopped me mid-step. Whispering. Fast whispering. Not casual, relaxed whispering. Not the kind couples share when everyone else is asleep and they're making weekend plans. No, this whispering had an edge to it, low, tense, and almost urgent. I stood still in the hallway, not because I intended to snoop, but because something in the tone of their voices instantly put me on alert. Sometimes it's not the words that shake you, it's the way they're spoken. I stepped closer to the corner where the hallway meets the living room, moving quietly out of habit. I wasn't trying to catch them in anything. I just didn't want to interrupt a private conversation if it wasn't meant for me. But before I could announce myself, before I could clear my throat or shuffle my slippers to let them know I was nearby, I heard my daughter's voice clearly. "We'll get it all done by Christmas," she whispered. Her voice wasn't angry or excited. It was determined, firm, too firm. Her husband muttered something I couldn't make out. Then she said the part that stopped my breath, left my mouth dry, and made my heart beat so hard it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. "She can't." Her voice faded, or maybe she lowered it. Either way, she didn't finish her sentence. But I didn't need her to. I knew, deep down in the part of me, that mothers used to sense storms before they appear, that she meant me. My first instinct was confusion, not fear. Shock, not panic. I wasn't the kind of mother who assumed the worst. I raised my daughter to be kind, responsible, loyal. At least, I thought I had. So, for a few seconds, my mind tried to assemble a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was talking about a project at work. Maybe they were planning a Christmas surprise. Maybe I misheard. But no matter how hard I tried to twist her unfinished sentence into something harmless, something ordinary, something that didn't involve my life being quietly discussed behind my back, I couldn't. It felt wrong. It felt personal. And it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. I took a slow step backward, careful not to make a sound. My hand trembled slightly as I held onto the edge of the wall for balance. I tried to breathe quietly so I wouldn't accidentally draw attention to myself. The last thing I wanted was for them to know I was listening, even if listening had been accidental. When I reached the safety of my bedroom doorway, I eased inside and gently closed the door, pressing my palm against the cool wood once it shut. It was only then, behind the thin protection of that door, that I finally allowed myself to exhale. My hands were shaking, my pulse was high, and my thoughts were racing so fast I couldn't catch any single one. What did they mean? What were they planning? Why Christmas? I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the soft glow of the night light I kept plugged in near the dresser. The room looked the same as it always did. Cozy, comfortable, familiar. But for the first time since I'd moved in, I didn't feel safe in it. I didn't feel welcome. I didn't feel home. It was strange how quickly a room could change simply by discovering what people say about you when they think you aren't listening. I rubbed my hands together to steady myself. It didn't help much. My mind kept returning to the moment. Emily's whisper, the tone of her voice, the unfinished sentence that hung in the air like a threat disguised as casual conversation. She can't. Can't what? Can't stop them? Can't live alone? Can't handle something? Can't make her own decisions? Every possibility felt worse than the last. I laid down on my bed, not because I was tired, but because my knees were suddenly weak. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe they were discussing decorations or repairs or something completely innocent. But the truth is, I've lived long enough to know when something is off. And nothing about that whisper felt innocent. The quiet of the room grew heavier the longer I lay there. The ticking of the small wall clock became more noticeable. I tried closing my eyes, hoping sleep would give me answers, or at least give my heart a chance to slow down. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay awake replaying every little moment from the past few weeks, searching for signs I hadn't noticed before. There had been a lot of small changes. Little questions about my bank account, comments about the size of my old house, a suggestion that maybe I shouldn't drive at night anymore, a conversation about how independent living can be hard for people my age. Nothing too obvious, nothing that would have raised red flags by itself. But tonight, all of those small moments connected like puzzle pieces forming an unsettling picture. And the picture wasn't pretty. Somewhere around midnight, I sat up and pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. My chest still felt tight. My mind wouldn't stop turning. I kept asking myself what had changed. Had I done something wrong? Had I been too dependent? Too quiet? Too trusting? I thought back to the first weeks after moving in. We ate dinners together. We watched old movies. We talked about the grandkids. I assumed those evenings meant something to her. I assumed we were bonding. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe those moments were just the calm before they made decisions without me. My heart ached at the possibility. I've always believed that family is supposed to be your safe place, your anchor, your comfort. And yet here I was, feeling like an intruder in my own daughter's home. I reached for the small journal I kept in the top drawer of my nightstand. I usually used it to write down grocery lists or recipes. That night, though, I wrote something different. 11:17 p.m. Heard Emily whisper, "We'll get it all done by Christmas." Then, "She can't." Just writing it down made my hand tremble again. But it also made it real, something I could return to. something I could analyze later. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't making assumptions. I heard what I heard. I sat there staring at those words for a long time. The more I looked at them, the more questions formed in my mind, and every question sharpened the sense of dread curling in my stomach. Around 1 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, casual footsteps. Emily's. She walked past my door, paused briefly, just long enough to make me hold my breath, and then continued toward her bedroom. That pause meant something. I felt it in my bones. Did she suspect I had heard her? Did she worry I might have misunderstood? Was she checking whether I was awake? I stayed perfectly still until her door closed. Then something new happened, something subtle but impossible to ignore. My bedroom suddenly felt colder, as though the warm trust I'd once had for my daughter had slipped out through the cracks in the walls. I pulled my blanket up again and tried to steady myself. I told myself I would get through the night and reassess things in the morning. But deep inside, I knew that nothing would feel normal anymore. Not after hearing that sentence. Not after sensing that something was being planned behind my back. Sleep eventually came, but only in short, uneasy stretches. Every time I drifted off, I woke again with a start, as if my mind refused to let me settle into peace. When the sun finally rose and I stepped out into the hallway the next morning, everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The same framed family photos on the wall, the same rug beneath my feet, the same kitchen filled with the smell of fresh coffee. But I was different, and the house didn't feel like home anymore. The night I heard what I wasn't supposed to hear didn't just open my eyes. It changed the course of everything that would come after. The morning after I overheard Emily's whisper, the house seemed normal on the surface, but the air felt heavier. I moved cautiously, noticing little things that I hadn't paid attention to before, details that now seemed to carry secret meanings. The coffee maker was already on when I entered the kitchen, a habit I had never seen Emily adopt so early in the day. She smiled at me, overly bright, like the kind of smile that tries too hard to cover something. I nodded politely, pretending I hadn't heard the night before, though my stomach churned. I set the table for breakfast, hands trembling slightly when I noticed that a stack of papers had been shuffled onto the counter. I couldn't resist glancing at them. Bills, I told myself, just bills. But one envelope had my name on it in a handwriting that wasn't mine. My pulse quickened as I carefully pulled it out. Inside was a letter from my bank, something I'd expected to receive myself, but which Emily had clearly intercepted. It felt like the first small crack in a dam, the first hint that what I had overheard might not be nonsense or a misunderstanding. As I moved through the house, I noticed Emily's husband, Mark, acting strangely. He was humming under his breath while cleaning, but his eyes darted toward me whenever I passed by. The tone of his humming wasn't soothing. It was almost mocking, the kind of sound that makes you aware someone is hiding something and testing whether you're aware. I wanted to speak up, ask if everything was all right, but my instincts told me to stay silent. There was power in watching, in quietly observing what others assume you aren't noticing. That afternoon, I found myself drawn to small, seemingly inconsequential moments that now felt like clues. Emily asked me what I thought about refinancing the house in a tone that sounded casual, but carried an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. I replied slowly, carefully, pretending to be naive, but every word I said was measured. My curiosity was eating at me, making me painfully aware of how little I truly knew about what they had been planning. I started paying attention to the way they spoke when they thought I wasn't listening. Emily and Mark would often step into another room or whisper in the hallway. Sometimes I catch fragments. It has to be done, or she won't understand, or worse, We need to make sure she can't stop us. Every sentence was a jigsaw puzzle piece, each one pushing me further into a pit of worry. My trust, which I had clung to for so long, felt like sand slipping through my fingers. By midweek, I noticed small financial anomalies. Checks I thought I had sent were missing, statements from my savings account didn't match my records, and one of my credit card statements had been opened and folded back in a way that made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily and Mark were more than just forgetful or careless. There was a calculated intent in their actions, subtle but undeniable. Late one night, I heard Emily's voice again, this time on the phone. She was whispering, and I could only catch bits and pieces. "Tomorrow we move forward," she said. "She can't see this coming." I didn't want to, but I pressed my ear closer to the cracked door, my heart hammering. The way she said it was clinical, almost rehearsed, like she had been planning something for weeks. My mind raced with questions I couldn't yet answer. The next morning, I noticed that Mark had left for work much earlier than usual. He kissed Emily goodbye with a forced tenderness that didn't match the tension I felt simmering in the house. I watched them go, a sense of isolation creeping in. Suddenly, I realized I was completely alone in trying to piece this together. It wasn't just a whisper in the night anymore. It was becoming a reality I couldn't ignore. I began making small, deliberate observations, jotting notes into my private journal. Every unusual action, every misplaced paper, every quiet conversation I overheard was recorded. I noted Emily's questions about my daily routine, her sudden curiosity about my medical appointments, and the odd way she insisted on reorganizing my room to make it more comfortable. Nothing about this felt innocent anymore. In the days that followed, I started to notice patterns. They were orchestrating their movements, subtly guiding my choices without my awareness. Emily would casually mention that I might be tired from household chores, suggesting I rest while she and Mark take care of things. She offered to pay some bills, insisting it would be easier for me if they handled it. Every gesture seemed helpful on the surface, but now it felt like a strategy, a way to slowly take control. I found myself becoming more vigilant, quietly checking my own paperwork, my finances, and my personal belongings. Things that had never concerned me before now required scrutiny. A bank statement here, a bill there, everything had to be reviewed. I realized with a sinking heart that the trust one had extended so freely was no longer sufficient. Something had shifted, and I needed to adapt or risk being blindsided completely. One evening, while Emily and Mark were arguing quietly in the next room, I overheard something that made my stomach twist. They were discussing my property, the house, and some legal documents that I had never signed. Emily's voice was calm but sharp. "We just need her out of the way," she said. "If we wait too long, she'll complicate everything." Mark muttered something in agreement, and for the first time, the weight of betrayal landed fully on my shoulders. The realization hit me hard. They weren't just talking about small changes or holiday plans. They were planning to manipulate my life, my finances, and possibly even where I lived. My trust had been exploited, and the betrayal came from the person I had considered my closest ally. The house that had felt safe only days ago now felt like a maze of secrets, whispers, and quiet threats. From that moment on, every small clue became magnified. A misfiled envelope was no longer an accident. It was a potential warning. A casual question about my health was no longer casual. It was reconnaissance. A comment about getting things done by Christmas was no longer vague. It was a deadline, and I was the target. I began testing their reactions carefully, asking innocuous questions, and noting how they responded. Emily's face would tighten, her tone would shift, or she'd offer an explanation that didn't sit right. Mark, too, displayed subtle signs: hesitation, too eager reassurances, and a tendency to watch me closely while pretending to be busy. Their behavior created a tension in the house that was palpable, and I felt like I was walking on glass with every step. It wasn't just about money or control. I realized it was about my autonomy, my ability to make decisions for myself, and the simple dignity of living my own life. And for the first time in decades, I understood the fragility of trust. I had always believed that love and family protected you, but now I knew that protection could be fragile, even among those closest to you. I started documenting everything meticulously: conversations, behaviors, odd coincidences, and inconsistencies. Every new clue added to a mental map of their intentions, a puzzle I had no choice but to solve. My journal became a lifeline, a way to organize my thoughts and give form to the unease that had been gnawing at me since that first night. Even small interactions with neighbors or friends became significant. I started paying attention to their expressions, subtle comments about my daughter and son-in-law, and the occasional slip that revealed more than it should. It was as if a hidden layer of reality had suddenly been exposed, and I was now seeing the world through a lens that demanded vigilance. One afternoon, I noticed Emily rifling through an old drawer in my room while I was in the kitchen. She quickly closed it when I walked by, but the look on her face, too quick, too careful, told me she hadn't expected me to notice. That moment was small, almost trivial, but it was another piece of the growing pattern. Everything she did was calculated, purposeful, and secretive. I began preparing myself mentally for confrontation, but I knew I needed more than instincts. I needed proof, clarity, and a plan that would allow me to act without giving away my awareness. Every small clue, every whispered conversation, and every suspicious gesture now had meaning. The night of the whisper had awakened me, and I couldn't go back to the naive, trusting self I had been before. The turning point came when I found a misplaced envelope tucked into a stack of magazines. Inside were letters from a realtor Emily had apparently been in contact with, discussing my property and financial matters without my consent. The handwriting was unmistakable, and my chest tightened as I realized how deep this went. It wasn't just planning, it was execution. And the execution was happening quietly, under the guise of family care and concern. From that moment, I decided I couldn't rely on intuition alone. I had to watch, listen, and gather evidence. Every small clue was now a building block for understanding the bigger picture. Every gesture, every word, every subtle shift in tone became part of a map I needed to navigate carefully. Even mundane moments became tense with significance. Emily offering to make dinner, or Mark volunteering to drive me somewhere was no longer simple kindness. Every gesture carried a potential ulterior motive, a way to control or distract me. And every time I ignored it or pretended not to notice, I felt the quiet satisfaction of preserving my awareness while keeping them unaware of my knowledge. The most chilling realization was that they believed I was oblivious. That belief gave them confidence, and it made my silent observation all the more critical. I was learning, adapting, and becoming alert in ways I hadn't thought possible at my age. And every small clue that turned into a bigger one was a reminder: knowledge is power, even in the most intimate and trusted spaces. By the end of that week, I had more pieces than I could have imagined. Hidden phone calls, financial discrepancies, and offhand comments had all converged into an unmistakable pattern. I could see the strategy unfolding like a chessboard, with me at the center. And though the anxiety was nearly unbearable, it was balanced by a new sense of clarity. I wasn't powerless. I could act. I could protect myself. I could survive this betrayal. For the first time since that fateful night, I felt a spark of resolve. The whispers, the glances, the small clues, they were no longer just scary hints of something sinister. They were my guides, showing me exactly how deep the deception ran and how carefully I needed to plan my next steps. I realized then that the smallest details, when observed closely, could reveal the biggest truths. And if I followed them carefully, I could reclaim my life before they realized I was awake to it all. The house felt heavier that morning. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting long streaks across the living room, yet it couldn't lighten the weight pressing down on me. Weeks of observing, noting, and quietly piecing together Emily and Mark's intentions had sharpened my awareness. Every glance, every word, and every tiny gesture now carried hidden meaning. And yet, despite all the small clues I had collected, something about the unfolding situation made me feel as if I were missing a central piece of the puzzle. It was while I was straightening a stack of holiday decorations in the corner of the garage that my eyes fell on the attic ladder. I had avoided that space since moving in. It was always too dusty, too cluttered, and, truthfully, too symbolic. The attic belonged to the past, boxes of old family albums, faded clothing, and the detritus of decades. I had always thought of it as sentimental storage, the kind of place one visits only to retrieve a forgotten ornament or a box of letters from a distant cousin. But that morning, it called to me in a way it hadn't before, as if it held the answers I didn't yet know I needed. I hesitated at the base of the ladder. My heart beat faster than usual. Perhaps it was fear of confronting what I might find, or perhaps it was the anticipation of discovery. My fingers hovered over the wooden rungs, dust coating my skin as I climbed slowly, step by cautious step. Each creak of the ladder echoed in the attic's cavernous space, bouncing off the walls and reminding me that I was completely alone. The attic smelled of old wood and mothballs, mixed with a faint scent of Emily's laundry detergent, likely tracked up by some careless handling. The air was thick and still, making it almost difficult to breathe. Light filtered through a single small window near the peak of the roof, creating a narrow shaft that illuminated dust motes dancing lazily in the air. For a moment, I felt like an intruder in a sacred, forgotten place. I started moving boxes carefully, shifting each one to avoid the familiar but treacherous piles of long-forgotten knickknacks. My hands brushed against the rough surfaces of cardboard and the brittle edges of old photo albums. Then, tucked behind a stack of linens and partially concealed by a faded quilt, I noticed a notebook. It was leather-bound, small, and the edges were worn from frequent handling. Oddly, it seemed too well used to be random attic clutter. Curiosity pushed me closer. As I lifted it, I noticed handwriting on the cover. It wasn't the neat, flowing cursive of a professional document or a school journal. It was familiar. My heart sank when I realized the scrawl belonged to Emily. I froze, gripping the notebook tightly, every instinct screaming at me to either toss it aside or run. But I couldn't. Something inside told me that this small leather-bound notebook might hold the answers I needed, the truth I had been chasing since the night of the whisper. I settled onto the floor, leaning against a dusty beam for support. The notebook felt heavier than its size suggested, as if it carried the weight of the secrets it contained. I opened it slowly, as though the act itself required caution. On the first page were dates and small notes, reminders, checklists, and names of people I didn't recognize immediately. My eyes scanned the entries carefully, noting references to the house, my savings account, and phrases that made my stomach turn. "She has to go by Christmas," one line read, followed by a series of scribbles and shorthand I didn't fully understand at first. Another entry mentioned a meeting with a realtor and what appeared to be a plan for arranging an assisted living option. My hands trembled as I flipped the pages, each new note intensifying the realization I had been dreading. Emily and Mark weren't just whispering plans. They were actively organizing steps to take control over my life and possessions. I paused, pressing my palm to my forehead. My mind raced through memories of seemingly innocuous conversations over the past few weeks. Emily's casual remarks about my health, her sudden interest in my finances, her insistence on helping me make decisions. Every small clue that had felt like paranoia now made perfect sense. The notebook was a roadmap, and I had been blind to it. Until now, a draft letter fell out from between the pages. It was addressed to a local real estate office, written in Emily's handwriting, with language outlining plans to sell the house and transfer certain assets. I felt a cold, not tighten, in my stomach. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was tangible. These weren't hypothetical thoughts or fleeting intentions. They were active steps, inked on paper, ready to be executed. I realized I had a choice: confront them immediately or gather more evidence to protect myself. Confrontation might trigger panic or anger, and I had no desire to act rashly. The notebook itself was proof, but I needed to understand the full extent of their plan. My mind flipped through the implications. If they succeeded, I could lose my home, my independence, and perhaps even my dignity in the process. The thought was unbearable. Determined, I continued exploring the attic. Behind a stack of old photo albums, I discovered a folder labeled with Emily's familiar handwriting. Inside were printed emails, notes, and what appeared to be a partial contract with a low-cost assisted living facility. The more I examined, the clearer it became that they had been planning this for weeks, maybe months, keeping me entirely unaware. Every page I turned revealed layers of betrayal I hadn't imagined. There were calculations about finances, suggestions for timing, and references to individuals who could facilitate their plan. Emily had even jotted notes about how to present it as a helpful suggestion, something I would supposedly agree to without realizing the full consequences. It was methodical, chillingly calculated, and designed to exploit my trust and my age. As I sat there, piecing together the information, a small envelope fell out from one of the folders. Inside were handwritten notes outlining step-by-step actions, the timing of certain conversations, reminders to distract me when questions arose, and even subtle instructions for Mark to handle potential resistance. The detail was meticulous, the intention clear. They were orchestrating an entire scenario to control my life, and it had been happening right under my nose. I leaned back against the beam, letting out a slow, measured breath. Anger surged first, hot and sharp, followed by a deep, simmering sadness. Emily was my daughter, the person I had raised with love and patience. And yet here she was, planning my displacement, assuming I would be naive enough to remain unaware. The emotional betrayal was almost harder to bear than the practical implications. For hours, I remained in that attic, meticulously examining each document, note, and page. I cross-referenced names, dates, and financial entries with what I knew from my own records. Every time I found a new link, a new connection, my sense of reality sharpened. They were thorough, clever, and relentless, but I was awake now. I wasn't naive anymore. It wasn't just the documents that disturbed me. It was the realization of how subtle their manipulation had been. Emily's everyday actions, the small gestures disguised as care, the repeated reassurances, all of it was part of a larger plan. Each clue I had ignored before now carried a new weight. The attic, which I had always thought of as a dusty storage space, had become a vault of truth, a place where secrets that could ruin my life were carefully hidden. I started organizing the material into my own system. Notes, letters, and drafts were sorted by urgency and relevance. I made a mental timeline of their actions, mapping out the steps they had planned and predicting the next moves they might take. I realized that the more I understood the scope of their plan, the more empowered I became. Knowledge, I discovered, was not just protection, it was armor. Around mid-afternoon, I heard footsteps approaching the attic ladder. My pulse quickened. Emily's voice called from downstairs, sweetly casual. "Iris, are you up there?" I didn't respond. She probably assumed I was rearranging holiday decorations or looking for something innocuous. I stayed silent, letting her assume ignorance. The notebook, letters, and drafts lay spread around me. I felt like a general surveying a battlefield, aware of every hidden trap and strategy. The attic was no longer just a room. It was a command center, a vantage point from which I could see the true scope of Emily and Mark's intentions. As the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows through the small window, I finally allowed myself a moment to absorb the enormity of what I had discovered. They weren't just planning something small or temporary. This was a deliberate effort to take control over my life, timed with precision around Christmas, a date that had previously felt joyful, but now carried a sinister undertone. I closed the notebook carefully, taking one last deep breath. Dust swirled in the fading light, making the air feel almost tangible. I felt a strange combination of exhaustion, fear, and clarity. The attic had revealed more than documents and plans. It had revealed the truth about who I was dealing with and the steps I would need to take next. Climbing down the ladder, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Emily and Mark might have assumed I was unaware, but that assumption had now worked in my favor. I had seen the evidence. I had traced the clues, and I had begun to understand the full depth of their intentions. The next steps in this quiet, calculated battle would require patience, strategy, and resolve, but I was ready. For the first time since hearing that whisper in the night, I felt like I had regained some control. The attic, once a place of dust and forgotten memories, had transformed into a place of awakening, a place where the small clues had finally turned into the bigger truth I could no longer ignore. Coming down from the attic that evening, I felt the weight of what I had discovered pressing into my chest like a physical force. Each document, every note, and the detailed plans of Emily and Mark made my stomach turn, but they also gave me clarity. I now understood that the whispers, the subtle questions, and the casual gestures that had seemed innocuous were all part of a carefully orchestrated plan to take control of my life. And yet, the most critical lesson I had learned that day was simple. I could not act impulsively. I had to pretend ignorance. Pretending not to know would give me an advantage. It would allow me to observe them, understand the full extent of their intentions, and gather proof without alerting them to my awareness. It was a delicate balance. One wrong glance, one misstep, and they could catch on, accelerating whatever plan they had set in motion. But I had learned long ago that patience often carries more power than confrontation, and now I would put that wisdom to the test. The first step was to create a system for documenting everything I noticed. I returned to my room, placing the leather-bound notebook from the attic beside my own journal. I carefully transcribed the most important details, dates, references, and actions I had observed. I used a simple code to mark urgency, ensuring that if Emily or Mark ever glimpsed my notes, they would see nothing out of the ordinary. Each entry felt like a small victory, proof that I could take control without revealing my awareness. I began keeping a log of their daily routines. Emily's sudden preoccupation with my finances, her seemingly casual inquiries about my health, and Mark's habit of checking my correspondence. All these details became entries in my private ledger. I labeled them carefully. Unusual question, why now, or document moved. Check originals tomorrow. Every small action, every minor slip was recorded meticulously. Over time, these small notes began forming a pattern, a roadmap of their intentions. While maintaining my outward composure, I tested their reactions in subtle ways. One morning, I asked Emily casually about a stack of papers she had moved from my desk, smiling politely as I spoke. Her response was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Oh, I just wanted to tidy up a bit." I thought you might appreciate it. Her tone was too cheerful, too deliberate, and I knew immediately that she had been caught off guard by my awareness. It was a small confirmation, a subtle piece of proof that my suspicions were accurate. At the same time, I needed external support, someone impartial who could help me verify and protect the evidence I was collecting. I reached out to an old friend, Margaret, who had spent decades as a social worker and had a keen understanding of elder care and family dynamics. I explained my concerns carefully, without revealing specifics that might alarm her or make her think I had misinterpreted the situation. Margaret immediately offered guidance. I would need to gather documented proof, track financial anomalies, and prepare for legal steps if necessary. Over the following days, I became a master of observation. I learned to watch without being watched, listen without drawing attention, and take notes without suspicion. Emily and Mark carried on as if nothing had changed, discussing plans in whispered tones and moving documents around the house. I observed every detail, from the timing of phone calls to subtle gestures, and each piece of information fed into my growing collection of proof. One evening, I noticed Emily leaving my room with a small envelope in her hand. My pulse quickened, but I remained calm, pretending to be absorbed in a crossword puzzle. I waited a few minutes before carefully following her to see where she placed it. She slipped it into a drawer in the living room desk, likely assuming I would never look. Later, under the cover of night, I retrieved it and discovered bank statements that had been tampered with, a clear attempt to mislead me about my finances. The discovery confirmed everything I had been fearing. Their plan was deliberate and ongoing. At the same time, I learned to use ordinary household moments to gather further evidence. While Emily prepared dinner, I casually glanced at papers left on the counter, noting dates, names, and references that corroborated the notes in the attic notebook. When Mark left for work, I checked emails and letters he had carelessly left open on his computer. Each small action became an opportunity to collect proof while maintaining the illusion of ignorance. I also began monitoring my own interactions, carefully testing their responses in subtle ways. I asked Mark about upcoming appointments and deliberately mentioned documents that were missing or out of place. His responses, overly casual and defensive, revealed panic beneath the surface. Emily, meanwhile, became slightly more guarded, pausing before answering routine questions and glancing at him for reassurance. Each reaction was a small victory, another piece of proof that they were aware I had not been entirely naive. The challenge, of course, was to remain calm in the face of mounting betrayal. Some days, I felt rage rising like a tide inside me, a hot, sharp energy that threatened to expose my awareness. But I reminded myself constantly, patience and strategy were my allies. Reacting emotionally would play into their hands. Remaining composed allowed me to collect proof, quietly strengthening my position for when the time came to confront them. I devised a system for categorizing the evidence I collected. Every document, note, and suspicious action was classified into 3 groups: immediate concern, supporting evidence, and observation. This method helped me prioritize my efforts and avoid being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. Even small details, like a casual remark about my health or a minor financial discrepancy, were noted because I knew that patterns emerge only when all the pieces are carefully tracked. One particularly unsettling moment occurred when I overheard Emily and Mark discussing a meeting with someone at a local office. They didn't mention names, but phrases like finalizing details and before she notices sent a shiver down my spine. I made a note immediately, recording the time, location, and context. Later, I cross-referenced it with the attic notebook and my own journal entries. The overlap confirmed that their actions were coordinated and deliberate, reinforcing the urgency of gathering as much proof as possible. I also became aware of how careful I needed to be with my own movements. Opening drawers, checking letters, or inspecting documents had to appear natural. I learned to mask my curiosity with casual conversation, asking Emily questions that seemed innocent while allowing my eyes to scan for discrepancies. Mark, too, became a subject of subtle testing, with my inquiries designed to gauge how much he was involved in the plan. Each response added clarity, revealing the depth of their scheme. There were moments of tension that almost broke my composure. Once I caught Emily rifling through a folder on my desk while I pretended to be in the kitchen. Her sudden glance toward me, and the sharp, almost defensive way she closed the folder sent my heart racing. I smiled politely and asked if she needed help with anything. Her hesitation before replying, her careful choice of words, told me more than anything she could have said outright. Another small clue, another confirmation. Over the next week, I expanded my methods. I began photographing documents with my phone, storing copies in a secure digital folder. I recorded conversations discreetly, ensuring I had evidence that could not be dismissed as misinterpretation. I even began noting behaviors outside the home. Unexpected visits, phone calls made at odd hours, and interactions with neighbors, all contributing to a comprehensive record of their intentions. The act of pretending ignorance became almost an art form. I smiled, engaged in polite conversation, and accepted help with a calm demeanor that belied my inner vigilance. Emily and Mark continued to operate as if I were unaware, but every move they made only strengthened the evidence I was gathering. Every whispered conversation, every altered document, every subtle attempt to control my actions became a brick in the foundation I was building for my eventual confrontation. At times, I caught glimpses of their overconfidence, moments when they assumed their manipulation was unnoticed. Emily would leave doors slightly ajar. Mark would leave letters unattended, and both would speak in tones that suggested they believed I was naive. Each lapse was a golden opportunity, and I seized them all, quietly collecting proof while outwardly maintaining composure. By the end of that period, I had amassed a significant collection: notebooks, letters, financial documents, photos, and recorded conversations. Every piece was carefully cataloged and cross-referenced. I understood their plan more fully than ever, yet I continued to wear the mask of a trusting, unsuspecting mother. That pretense was critical. It allowed me to observe, gather proof, and plan my next steps without alerting them. For the first time in weeks, I felt a mixture of power and clarity. The fear and betrayal still lingered, but now they were tempered with strategy. I knew that when the moment came to act, I would have more than intuition. I would have undeniable evidence. Pretending not to know had transformed from a survival tactic into a tool of empowerment. And as I lay awake that night, cataloging each detail in my journal and reviewing every small clue, I realized that the act of gathering proof was itself a form of resistance. It was quiet, deliberate, and careful, but it gave me control in a situation where so much had been stolen from me. I was no longer a passive observer of betrayal. I had become an active participant in reclaiming my life, one careful step at a time. Christmas morning arrived, quietly, almost deceptively so. The house was decorated in its usual festive manner. Lights twinkling softly, the scent of pine mingling with cinnamon from the kitchen, and the faint hum of carolers on the radio. Yet beneath the cheerful facade, tension rippled invisibly. I had spent weeks gathering proof, observing, documenting, and pretending ignorance. Every moment of pretense had led to this day. The culmination of their schemes and of my quiet preparation was about to intersect. I moved carefully, making breakfast as usual, flipping pancakes and brewing coffee. I kept my tone light and cheerful when Emily appeared in the kitchen, already dressed in festive attire. "Good morning, Mom," she chirped, her voice almost too bright, too practiced. I smiled, returning the greeting, making sure to sound relaxed, casual. Inside, I was a storm of anticipation, but outwardly, I was the picture of calm. Mark joined us, carrying a box of ornaments for the tree. His movements were deliberate, cautious, as if even he felt the subtle undercurrent of tension I had cultivated without them realizing. I noted every glance, every hesitation, every nuance. This day was critical. Every action, every conversation, and every small reaction could either solidify their plan or expose it completely. After breakfast, Emily suggested opening presents. I agreed, of course, masking any suspicion. But as we gathered in the living room, I subtly placed the attic notebook and my compiled evidence on a nearby shelf within reach, knowing that I could access them quickly if needed. The presents lay under the tree, bright, cheerful, and inconsequential compared to the storm brewing in our home. As Emily handed me a gift, I noticed her hands were slightly trembling. Mark's smile was taut, almost forced. They had assumed I was oblivious, and in that assumption, they were vulnerable. I had watched for weeks as they orchestrated every small action, every distraction, every manipulation. Now, the tables were about to turn, not with confrontation, but with the quiet, undeniable force of evidence. I began the process subtly, carefully introducing topics that touched on their actions without directly accusing them. I was reviewing some of the paperwork in the attic, I said casually, glancing toward the shelf where the notebook rested. Emily's hand froze mid-motion, the wrapping paper sliding slightly from a gift in her lap. "Oh, just old documents," she murmured, her tone betraying more than she intended. I smiled, setting the tone. "It's amazing what you find when you look closely. Some of these letters and notes, well, they're very detailed, aren't they?" I let my words hang in the air, observing every reaction. Mark's brow furrowed, and Emily's eyes flickered nervously. Their carefully constructed confidence was cracking under the subtle pressure of my controlled, measured remarks. Next, I began referencing small inconsistencies I had recorded. I noticed some statements were missing. I said lightly, as if mentioning a trivial observation. I must have misplaced them. Emily shifted uncomfortably, fidgeting with the edge of her dress. "Oh, those? Must be nothing, Mom. Just some mix-up, I'm sure." Her attempt to dismiss the comment felt hollow, and I could see the tension in her shoulders. I allowed the conversation to continue naturally, letting them reveal their own anxieties through subtle slips. I wasn't angry, not yet. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked questions, observed, and allowed their reactions to speak louder than any accusation I could make. Every defensive word, every careful pause, was proof of the extent of their scheming. After a few moments, I gently shifted the topic toward the assistance, plans they had been quietly orchestrating. I was thinking about those suggestions you made for my living arrangements. I said softly, "I've been reviewing what's best for me, and I want to make sure everything is considered carefully." Emily's lips pressed together, and Mark looked away, unable to meet my eyes. The attic notebook, my journal, and the photographs I had collected weighed heavily on my mind, giving me confidence that my calm strategy was working. I then produced a folder from my lap, casually placing it on the coffee table. The top sheet, filled with Emily's handwriting, was visible. I found this while organizing some old files. I explained, keeping my tone light, almost conversational. "It's amazing what you can learn from old notes. Some of the things written here, plans, timelines, it's all very detailed." My voice remained gentle, but the message was clear. Evidence spoke louder than emotion. Emily's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced at Mark. "Mom, that's not what it looks like," she said, voice slightly higher than usual, the first sign of panic I had heard from her. Mark shifted, trying to appear calm, but I could see the subtle tremor in his hand as he reached for his coffee mug. They believed I had been naive, that I hadn't noticed, and now they realized I had full awareness. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I simply smiled and said, I always notice more than people think, Emily, and when I pay attention, I make sure to record it carefully. The weight in the room shifted. I could feel the energy of control tipping toward me, steady and deliberate. I had been patient, observant, and strategic, and now, in the quiet glow of the Christmas morning light, the proof I had gathered was impossible to ignore. Then I introduced another layer, legal documentation. I've been consulting Margaret. I added, keeping my tone casual. She reminded me that any actions taken without consent, especially regarding finances and living arrangements, can have serious consequences. The subtle threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to act rashly. The proof, and my careful presentation of it, was more than enough to assert control. Emily and Mark exchanged hurried glances. The confident composure they had maintained for weeks began to crumble. Emily's hands trembled as she attempted to explain, words faltering. Mom, we just wanted to help, she stammered. Mark added, we didn't mean, but I interrupted gently. I understand the intention, but the execution is what matters. And it's something I've been keeping track of carefully. The room grew tense, yet calm in a way that felt almost cinematic. The Christmas lights reflected off the ornaments, casting small sparkles across the walls, and the quiet ticking of the clock emphasized the gravity of the moment. I had created a situation where confrontation wasn't necessary. The evidence did the work, and the act of observation, preparation, and patience had empowered me fully. I then invited them to sit with me and review everything together, pretending it was a casual discussion about holiday organization. As we went through the notes, letters, and photographs, Emily's expression shifted from defensive to shocked, and Mark's from nervous to defeated. Each small slip, every miscalculation they had made, was cataloged, analyzed, and displayed calmly, turning their confidence into vulnerability. Throughout the morning, I allowed moments for reflection and conversation, emphasizing fairness and reason rather than anger or vengeance. I know you thought I wouldn't notice, I said softly, but everything has a consequence. And now that I'm aware, we can figure out a path that respects everyone, including me. The subtle power in my words was undeniable. They had expected to manipulate and control, but instead, they were faced with someone who had observed, documented, and prepared without losing composure. By mid-afternoon, the tension eased slightly, but the lesson remained clear. Underestimating me had been a critical mistake. Emily and Mark realized that manipulation, deception, and secrecy could not succeed when faced with patience, awareness, and evidence. Christmas, a day they had assumed would serve their timeline, instead became a day of reckoning. I concluded the day with quiet reflection. Sitting by the tree, watching the soft flicker of lights, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The betrayal had been real, the preparation necessary, but I had emerged empowered rather than defeated. My careful, deliberate approach to gathering proof had not only protected my life and independence, but had also demonstrated the strength of patience, observation, and strategy in the face of betrayal. As Emily and Mark silently absorbed the consequences of their actions, I realized something profound. Revenge was not necessary to assert power. Awareness, preparation, and the quiet presentation of truth were more than enough. I had reclaimed my autonomy, my home, and my dignity without losing myself to anger or impulsive action. The Christmas they had planned for control had transformed into a celebration of awareness, empowerment, and measured justice. That evening, as the last carol played softly on the radio and the house settled into the quiet of the season, I felt a sense of peace. The attic had revealed the depth of deception. Weeks of careful observation had provided the proof I needed, and now the deceptive plans that had threatened to undermine my life were fully exposed. The Christmas they weren't expecting had arrived, and I was finally free to breathe, confident in my ability to protect myself and my future. As the house finally settled into its quiet evening rhythm, I sat alone by the soft glow of the Christmas tree, letting the warmth of the lights wash over me. The events of the past weeks played in my mind like a slow-motion film. Every whispered plan, every subtle manipulation, every small betrayal carefully orchestrated by the people I had loved and trusted most. The ache of betrayal still lingered in my chest, a dull, persistent weight, but it was tempered now by the strength I had discovered within myself. I realized something essential. The power to reclaim my life, my independence, and my dignity had never truly belonged to anyone else. It had always been inside me, waiting for me to notice and assert it. The truth I had uncovered in the attic, the painstaking evidence I had gathered while pretending ignorance, and the careful strategy one had followed had all converged to give me clarity and control. I felt an almost dizzying sense of relief knowing that my patience and vigilance had not been wasted, that my deliberate actions had prevented a betrayal from completely reshaping my life. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, appreciating the ordinary beauty of the season, the scent of pine, the faint clink of ornaments, the soft hum of a Christmas song playing somewhere in the background, without the constant shadow of fear and suspicion looming over me. It struck me, in that quiet, reflective moment, how often we underestimate our own strength until we are tested. Emily and Mark had assumed I was naive, incapable of recognizing their intentions, and willing to follow along blindly. They had planned meticulously, believing that secrecy, manipulation, and careful timing would give them control. And yet, their greatest oversight had been to assume that love and trust automatically meant ignorance. My vigilance, my observation, and my determination to act without emotion had become my armor, and the very tactics they had counted on had become the evidence of their undoing. The irony was not lost on me. In pretending not to know, I had cultivated power. In documenting, observing, and patiently waiting, I had reclaimed agency over my life in a way that raw confrontation could never have achieved. As I thought about the future, I realized that the events of this Christmas would remain a turning point in my life. I had learned to trust my instincts, to value evidence over assumption, and to recognize the subtle ways that people, even those closest to us, can manipulate and deceive. But more importantly, I had discovered resilience, the kind of quiet, determined resilience that doesn't need to shout to be felt, the kind that grows steadily in the background until it is strong enough to protect and preserve everything you hold dear. Emily and Mark would have to reconsider their actions, and our relationship would never be quite the same, but I had achieved something far more valuable than reconciliation or revenge. I had preserved my autonomy and proved to myself more than anyone else that I am capable of protecting my life, my home, and my peace of mind. Sitting there, surrounded by the gentle glow of Christmas lights, I allowed myself a small, bittersweet smile. This holiday, which they had expected to control and manipulate, had become a celebration of awareness, courage, and personal empowerment. I understood now that betrayal could never fully take root when met with vigilance, patience, and clarity. The Christmas they weren't expecting had become mine, not through confrontation, not through rage, but through quiet strength, deliberate action, and the unwavering refusal to surrender my life to deceit. And as the night deepened and the house settled into a gentle stillness, I realized that the greatest gift I had ever received was not beneath the tree, but inside me. The knowledge that I could face betrayal, endure the pain of disappointment, and emerge stronger, wiser, and unshakably in control of my own destiny.